This is a Ferrari Monza SP1, and it's one of the most amazing, special, incredible modern Ferrari models. Ferrari these days has become something of a volume brand. They sell a lot of Portofinos and Romas and everything else, but this car is truly special. It costs around $2 million. It has one seat, and Ferrari says they're only going to make 500 of these for the entire world. And today I'm going to review this one. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era, now with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And you should, because we've had some fantastic sales recently, including this wonderful Ferrari 360 Spider sold for $87,000. This gorgeous F430 Spider with a gated 6-speed manual brought $220,000. And this wonderful E92 BMW M3 Lime Rock Park Edition sold for over $95,000, setting a record for this type of car. If you're looking to buy or sell an enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it, with daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. So let's talk Monza. This is the very first car from Ferrari's new Icona series, where they're going to make some new models based on iconic Ferraris from years past. The Monza recalls the legendary 250 Testarossa, which was an open-roof race car Ferrari from the 1950s. And I suspect the Monza will someday be a legend too. $2 million, 500 units for the whole world, sure, but it goes beyond that. This is truly a Ferrari like no other. Under the hood, you have an 800 horsepower V12 borrowed from the Ferrari 812, but everything else is different. For example, you have no roof at all. It doesn't exist. There's not even a windshield, and you only have one seat. Forget about storage space. This car doesn't even have enough room for a passenger. Oh yeah, and it's not street legal. $2 million, and you can't even drive this on the street. And today I'm gonna review it. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Monza and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. There are many. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Monza SP1 with undoubtedly its quirkiest quirk, and that would be the fact that it only has one seat. And yes, as you can see, it really does only have a driver's seat. There's no second seat, back seats, nothing like that. This is a single-seater car. So you're probably wondering, why? Why do this? It's so ridiculously impractical to have just a single-seater car. But there are good reasons for it, all of which revolve around the fact that this car is primarily intended for racetrack use, for track driving. And so there's only one seat because that allows them to create a more aerodynamic car. You can see in the hole where the second seat would be, they've covered it up with a body panel, which obviously allows for better airflow and aerodynamics than a passenger seat sticking up in this spot. Also, it allows for weight reduction. You don't really need a passenger on the racetrack, and so to make this car as lightweight and track focused as possible, you get rid of stuff you don't need, like a passenger seat apparently. And of course, that's also why this car doesn't have a roof, because if you add a roof, metal or a folding convertible top, either way, it adds weight. The lightest weight roof is no roof at all, and so this car, to save weight, ditches the passenger seat and ditches the roof, although it doesn't really help all that much. The Monza SP1 is based on the Ferrari 812, and this car only weighs about 60 pounds less than an 812. Even though it has only one seat and no roof, they only lost 60 pounds in their pursuit of weight reduction. But hey, it's the thought that counts. But anyway, next up, let's move on to the rest of this car's quirks and features. There are many. I'm gonna start with getting in, where insanely, the Monza just has a regular Ferrari key. You can see it here, looks completely normal, even though this car is far from normal. That's especially weird because the key has lock and unlock buttons on it. And believe it or not, they actually function. If you press lock, the door locks, and then you can't open it. Oh, how are you gonna get in the car? It doesn't have a roof. You can still reach right in. You press unlock, and then the door unlocks. So for some reason, this car has power locks in the remote, but it's open. It doesn't really make any sense. But anyway, you get past the normal key, and pretty much everything else about this car is ridiculous, starting with climbing in. You look on the outside, there's no door handle. There's no keyhole. There's actually no way to access the door from the outside of this car at all. In order to open the door, you have to reach inside. There's this leather strap here you can see. It's mounted high up so you can easily reach it. You pull on that, and then the door opens up. And it literally opens upwards. You can see kind of a cool motion, looking like a supercar door should. The door, by the way, weighs basically nothing. Tremendously lightweight door opening upwards. But probably the most interesting thing about this car's door situation is that when you have the door open, it's not actually a lot easier to climb inside than when you have the door closed. And that's because the door sill is absolutely massively tall in this car. The door is so lightweight in part because it's just tiny, and the sill is absolutely huge. Even with the door open, you're climbing over a very high piece in order to get into the car and into the driver's seat. But anyway, once you climb over this door sill, you get access to the driver's seat, or I guess I should just say the seat, since it's the only one, and there's a lot to discuss in this interior. Let's start with the seat itself. You can see a Ferrari racing seat with nice bolstering, and you can see this particular seat is very beautiful, a gorgeous color, this dark old-fashioned leather with lighter stitching. Really complements the look of this car. It is very nice. Now the other thing you notice instantly about the seat is there's a racing harness built into it. You don't have a standard 3-point seatbelt like you do in most other cars because, like I said, this is mainly intended for racetrack use, so you get a racing harness. Now, once you climb in here and sit down, the first thing you notice is you don't have a windshield. You probably already noticed that, but you definitely notice it when you sit in here and you realize that if you're gonna drive this thing, you're about to get hit with an enormous amount of air, although Ferrari says that doesn't happen. According to Ferrari, this car has something called a virtual windshield. And the way this works is air is coming towards the car and it goes in through the grille, as you can see, this large grille, and then it's kind of compacted under the hood, and it's sent out and upwards at this slot directly ahead of the gauge cluster. And so it's intended to go up and over you when you're sitting in the car, so it doesn't really need a windshield since air passes right over you, or at least that's what Ferrari says. We'll see how true that is when I actually get behind the wheel. And by the way, Ferrari also says that due to the way this all functions, the virtual windshield, you actually get hit with less air as you go faster, because then it can send it out through this slot even faster and send it above you. So we'll test and see that. Now, that all is a pretty cool idea, but the lack of a windshield is one of the many reasons why this car is not street legal here in the United States. That's a government regulation in order to sell cars here, no surprise, but this car has no windshield, so you can't. This is street legal in Europe, but not here in the States. It's also a little bit of a drawback because it means that you have to wear either a helmet or goggles every single time you drive this car. No matter how good the virtual windshield is, you can't chance like a rock coming up and hitting you in the face. So that kind of limits the practicality of the Monza just a little bit, no windshield. But that's kind of the point of this car, impracticality. You often hear people say, oh, supercars and hypercars are too easy to drive these days, and back in my day, you had to make compromises to drive a supercar. Well, if you want to make compromises, how about a car with only one seat, no roof, and no windshield? And there are more compromises than just that. For example, there's no like handle you pull in order to close the door. It doesn't have like a door handle on it when you're closing it. You just have to kind of find a spot and pull. There's also no power windows because there's no window at all in the door. None. It's just a door. And because there's no windshield, there's also no spot to mount a rear view mirror. Although this car does still have one, and it's here, this carbon fiber piece that sticks up from this giant carbon fiber piece next to the steering wheel. That's your rearview mirror, although it isn't adjustable. It's fixed in place. I hope you like the placement of the rearview mirror because you're not changing it. And if it doesn't work, you just kind of got to move your body around until it does. Strangely, though, as compromised as this car is in many ways, it also has a bizarre amount of creature comforts. For example, it has climate control, not just heat, but also air conditioning. This car with no roof or windshield has air conditioning, which makes absolutely no sense at all. But I guess when you're sitting in heavy traffic in Monaco, idling and moving slowly, it would be nice for cold air to blow on you, since you're not necessarily getting the benefit of the wind while you're driving this car. Still kind of crazy to see that luxury in a car with so few other ones. And by the way, that air conditioning comes out of these two climate vents. There are two in this car, one on each side of the steering wheel, and they blow the hot or cold air on the driver. Now, those air conditioning controls, like I showed you, are in the center console, and the center console is an interesting place because it includes a lot of different controls for this vehicle. Below the climate controls, you can see different transmission controls. R puts you in reverse, auto puts you in automatic mode, so you don't have to shift gears yourself, and launch, of course, is your launch control. And directly above that, you can see the circle for the hazard lights. Now, above the climate controls in the center stack here, you can see various different dials and buttons. These control the two screens that you have in this car's gauge cluster. Now, this is one of the few familiar things about the Monza SP1 because these gauge screens are also used in the Ferrari 812, which this car is loosely based on. The controls at the top control the screen over on the left, and the controls at the bottom control the screen over on the right. And frankly, this is kind of confusing because they both have two dials and some buttons in between. It makes a lot more sense in the 812 where the controls are actually placed directly next to their respective screens. But here, they're next to each other, and it's hard to figure out exactly what controls what. The basic gist of these screens, the one over on the left is like car information. So it shows like your speed, various gauges, temperature readouts, tire pressures, lap times, all that stuff is over on the left. The one on the right you can think of as more of an infotainment screen, and it'll show like navigation, map, and the music and media and phone that you're playing and all that sort of stuff. So the two screens are distinct, but the controls are right next to each other, which makes things a little bit confusing. Also worth noting about these screens, this is old technology for Ferrari. New Ferrari models have a totally different interior where a lot more stuff has been moved to screens and touch screens, but even though this is a new car, it's based on the 812, which came out several years ago, and so it still uses this older 812 technology as opposed to the new stuff you find in more modern Ferraris. Now, the last notable items here on the center control stack are fairly standard buttons. You have your axle lift button here. You press that and the car lifts itself up to clear low curbs. You can turn on or off stop start here. You can put it in tow mode, turn off the parking sensors, and you have your door locks here. So you're driving along, you don't want someone to open your door, you press the lock button, and then well, they can just reach in anyway. It's ridiculous. But anyway, speaking of the center console and control area, probably the most interesting thing in here, maybe aside from the air conditioning, is this velvet key slot. This is here in case you don't want to like deal with your key while you're driving. You don't have pockets, you want somewhere to put it. You can stick it in the velvet key slot and drive along, and then your key has a nice little home inside the car, and you don't have to think about where you put it. Now, directly above that key slot, you can see a fire extinguisher, which is over on what would be the passenger seat if this car had a passenger seat, but it doesn't, although it could. This is the Monza SP1, and it's sold with one single seat, but Ferrari is also offering the Monza SP2, and that is sold with two seats. And if you get the two-seater version, they remove this panel over the hole for the other seat, and they stick in a seat, and you also lose your handy fire extinguisher. Now, I mentioned earlier, Ferrari says they're going to build 500 of these, and that is a total number including both cars. So they're not building 500 500 SP1s and 500 SP2s, but 500 total. And it'll be interesting to see exactly what buyers of this car pick. My guess is most people will choose the SP2 because it's more practical, and that means the SP1 will probably end up being the rarer one that becomes more valuable, even though it's far less usable for an already pretty unusable car. Now, it's also worth noting that the SP1 is, of course, lighter compared to the SP2 since it doesn't have a passenger seat. If you get this in the one-seater version like this car, you lose about 50 pounds compared to the two-seat models. This is slightly more lightweight. Now, a couple of other items worth noting about what would be the passenger side of this interior. For one thing, it looks like this panel is removable. You can see these two latches on the back side of it. You can lift those up and kind of unlatch it, but I can't figure out how to take it off from there, and I'm not going to start experimenting, but it does look like this panel is removable. But more interesting than that, if you look at this car from the passenger side, you'll notice it looks like it has a door over there. So that might get you wondering. You climb back over here, and if you look into the void where the passenger seat would be, and if you shine a light in there, you can see that yes, not only is it a door, but it has the exact same door panel as you have on the driver's side. The same carbon fiber and leather trim, they even painted it. It doesn't just have some ugly unpainted thing, since this door will never be used. It actually has a passenger door that will never ever be opened, but it's over there in case for some reason you do want to open it. It's possible. It's crazy. But anyway, back to the rest of this car and the rest of the interior. Now, one thing inside here that's familiar from other Ferrari models is the steering wheel, which is basically the same wheel you see on other Ferraris, including the 812. You have the engine start button on the steering wheel, and you also have your turn signals mounted on the steering wheel in easy reach of your thumbs, which is pretty cool. The most interesting thing about this steering wheel always is this dial in the lower right corner, which allows you to change your drive modes. And I love the fact that there's no normal drive mode. Sport is your base drive mode, and then you can go from there to race, which is even sportier, or to other drive modes that let you turn off your traction and stability control, which frankly sounds terrifying. Most interesting in this car, though, is there is a wet drive mode, even though no one is ever going to drive this car when it's wet because it has no roof or windshield, and because it costs $2 million. But the drive mode is still there. Anyway, next up, more interesting items in this interior. For one thing, as you might imagine, there is basically no storage in here. Of course, there is no glove box, although for all we know, it may just be sitting over there. Unusable. But anyway, there's basically no storage in this interior. You do have a little storage panel to the left of the seat you can see here, which actually is reasonably practical, and it also has a USB port directly in front of it, which is a pretty cool idea because then you can plug in your phone to this USB port and stick your phone in a little storage compartment, so it's all fairly convenient. By the way, I want to go back just a second. I was talking about storage and I joked that there might be a glove box over on the passenger side of this car. Well, I shined my little light into this hole where the passenger compartment would be, and there is a glove box, fully leather, fully stitched, just like you would expect in a car with two seats. You can also see a climate control vent over there, even though nobody is ever going to use it. So to create the Monza SP1, it appears Ferrari didn't actually give you some purpose-built single-seater. Instead, they just pulled out the passenger seat and nothing else over on the passenger side. They kept all of that stuff, and then they just put a cover over it, which frankly is the right amount of ridiculous for this car. Now, over to the left side of the steering wheel, you have some fairly usual controls in here for a fairly unusual car. On the door panel, you can see the power mirror control is mounted here, so obviously you can use this to adjust your mirrors. And then when you move into the dashboard more below the climate vent, you have your headlight control here, as you can see. You have your fuel door control, and your parking brake is down here, and you have the button to open the trunk. Yes, that's right, the trunk. Because you see, as ridiculously compromised as this car is, it does still have a trunk. And the trunk panel is absolutely massive. You can see it takes up basically the entire rear half of the car with these curves on the sides and, of course, this hump behind the driver's seat for safety, for rollover protection. All of that has to come up when you open up the trunk. So you can unlatch the trunk in two places. there's that button I showed you in the interior, or you press the trunk button on the key fob, which just looks like a normal trunk button for a normal car, even though this is neither of those things. But anyway, you press the trunk button, the trunk pops open, and then you just lift it up and access the cargo area in this car. You can see it's actually unusually large. The cargo area in here is quite big and quite practical for a car that is absolutely the least practical thing in the world. At least you can carry your bag and the bag of a friend. But you can't actually carry the friend. You can only carry their bag. Anyway, also in this trunk, you have this cool plaque mounted on the back wall of the trunk that shows all the options that this car has. This one was spec'd out beautifully. It's a fantastic car, really, really gorgeous, and all these options were carefully selected. They look great, and you can see them all here. You also have underneath the trunk floor, you can lift this little loop, and you can see the toolkit in this car, which of course is ridiculous, the idea that you might work on it yourself if you happen to break it down in your SP1, but it's there, and it's cool, and it's kind of a Ferrari hallmark, and it's even included in this car. But anyway, next up, since I'm around back in the SP1, there's a lot of cool stuff to discuss on the outside of this car, and I want to start with the taillights, which you can see are very neat. They're in this sort of sinister looking U shape, very thin little shape that goes around the entire rear of the car, and you can actually trace this little line that houses the taillights all the way around the entire upper half of the car, around the passenger compartment and everything. It's kind of a cool way to integrate the taillights into this already existing line. A couple of other cool things back here. One is the turn signals. You put them on, you can see an even thinner little strip that turns on as the turn signal, which is a very cool look. And when you put on the brake lights in this car, it's kind of an interesting thing. Basically, the lower part of the taillight U shape just gets brighter, as you can see, and a third brake light turns on in the middle, although it's a very thin little strip mounted directly above the rest of the brake lights. There's really nowhere else you can mount a third brake light in this car, so that's where they did it. But that's how the lighting works in the back of the Monza. Kind of interesting. Now, speaking of lighting, there's a couple other interesting items worth mentioning about the lighting. For one, when you put on the turn signal, the side turn signal lights up here on this little vent on the side of the car, which is kind of a cool integration, and that vent also looks pretty good, even turn signal-lessly. It's a neat thing to see there. Now, in front, interestingly, the lighting is really not all that unusual. You can see when the headlights are on, the headlight is the upper portion, and then you also have a running light sort of in the middle of the headlight housing. Nothing too crazy or quirky in there. When you turn on the turn signal in front, the turn signal just replaces the running light like it does on a lot of other cars. So a lot of distinctive design touches on the outside of this car, obviously, but the headlights aren't really one of them. Nothing too unusual there. Now, also up front, you have, of course, the engine, but I can't show it to you. That's because it is under an even more massive panel than what you had in back for the trunk. You can see the front panel stretches from basically the bumper all the way to the steering wheel, going down the entire front of the car. It even includes the mirrors, and so this one doesn't open. It's fixed in place, and I assume you have to go to a Ferrari dealer and trained factory technicians in order to open it and check out the engine. It's really huge up here. But I can at least tell you about the engine. So this is the same power plant you have in the Ferrari 812 Superfast, on which the Monza is sort of loosely based. 6.5 liter naturally aspirated V12. In the 812, this engine makes 790 horsepower. But in this car, it gets like a token little boost to 800 horsepower, which is a substantial figure, and torque is the same between the two powertrains at 530 pound-feet. So when it comes to the numbers for this car, it is slightly more powerful and ever so slightly lighter weight, which means the performance of this is probably a little bit better than the 812. Ferrari says 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds for this car, 2.8, 2.9 seconds, which obviously is a really insane figure, especially without a windshield. Now, a couple of other number differences for the Monza compared to the 812. One is height. This car is about 5 inches lower than the 812, which obviously makes sense. And frankly, that height is only achieved at the post above the driver's seat, which is there for rollover safety. The entire rest of this car is a lot lower than that. It's a really, really low car, and visually it looks different than everything else on the road. Ferrari also says the SP1 is about an inch wider than a regular 812. Things are modified considerably compared to the standard 812 with the exception of the powertrain and a few interior bits like I showed you. And speaking of the powertrain, let's talk exhaust. This car, big naturally aspirated V12 and big exhaust tips back here. Let's take a listen to how the Monza sounds. And finally, I want to discuss the Monza's market position and its positioning in Ferrari's lineup, which is kind of interesting because these new Icona Ferrari cars that are sort of modern takes on legendary Ferraris, they haven't done this before, and they've just started with the Monza SP1 and SP2, and they've recently announced the new SP3, which is a totally radical, insane thing that's going to continue what these cars have started. Now, the Monza is based on some really special old school Ferraris. Like I said, the 250 Testarossa and also the 750 Monza and the 166 MM, and I think this is a cool way for Ferrari to get in touch with its heritage. It also is an important way for Ferrari to connect with some of its highest value customers because ultimately Ferrari is becoming a more volume brand. You got Portofinos and Romas that Ferrari's really trying to sell a lot of in order to bolster sales numbers and profits and please their shareholders. And I think they're worried there might be some risk that they're perceived as not as exotic or rare as special as they once were. And cars like these will certainly go a long way to satisfy some of the wealthier clients who are tired of seeing Portofinos on every corner. Well, you won't see one of these on every corner. It still makes Ferrari feel special and exciting, and it kind of connotes these legendary cars from Ferrari's past in the modern era. It's a neat idea, and it's a cool little spot in Ferrari's lineup, if you can afford it, and if you're selected to buy it, since these are so rare. And so those are all the quirks and features of the very quirky Ferrari Monza SP1. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, here I am driving the Monza SP1, and I gotta say, this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime amazing thing for me. I drive a lot of really cool and special cars, but when this first came out, I thought to myself, that is kind of like the magic that Ferrari is all about. These ridiculous, ultra crazy, low production things that you never see. Like when I think of Ferrari, that's what I think of, not Portofinos. And so this is a very, very, very exciting thing for me. As you can probably tell throughout this video, I am pumped. So, before I get started talking about the driving experience, I want to mention how I'm driving this car. Like I said, it's not street legal. I'm driving it in private land on a street on a private space, so I can do that. In fact, I'm at a racetrack, but not on the racetrack, so I'm just kind of driving it around the roads around the track. And obviously that's legal if you're going to drive it in private, but otherwise the car can be imported kind of only for racetrack driving use, which is why the car is here at the racetrack, so it can be used here. I believe these are importable under the show or display rule here in the United States, which I've mentioned in other videos. I'm not going to get into it here because I want to drive the Monza, so let's do it. Okay, so first things first, I mean, it's amazing. It's so cool to be in this completely open cockpit vehicle. And I gotta say, there was some cynicism about this car in the Ferrari world when it first came out, about how it was sort of just like this 812 with a different body. I mean, whatever you want, but sitting here, it feels like I'm driving a modern interpretation of a 250 Testarossa. I got my mirrors way out in front of me. I'm fully open all the way around. Like, this is cool as hell. And I think being able to do this on the racetrack would be the coolest experience of my entire existence. And it's so amazing. It's such a cool thing. Now, this car is brand new, like brand new. It's only got like 15 miles on it. So I don't want to go too crazy with it, especially because it also costs $2 million. And so I want to be pretty reasonable. But I have to say, part of the experience and part of the craziness and the fun of this car is just sitting here and enjoying, like, this is amazing. This is so cool. It's like fully open. I feel like I'm in some ultra expensive vintage Ferrari because I can see the fenders, and it's so cool. It is such a cool experience. I drive a lot of cars, and sitting behind the wheel of this one is one of the most special feeling experiences I've ever had in a supercar, and I mean that sincerely. So let's talk a little bit about performance. Obviously, I've driven the 812 and I've driven the 812 GTS, so I kind of know what to expect from this powertrain and from a vehicle about this size. Obviously, the Monza is completely different from anything else because of
the construction, the body, the way this all is. And so it's a different experience, but in some senses, it's about the same, at least from a like power and powertrain standpoint, transmission shifting, which means you have a fantastically great V12. I've driven this car hard in the 812 form, and it is fun. It is fast and it's exciting, and it's a total thrill to just jam on the throttle. Incredibly responsive powertrain, incredibly immediate, and that's also true of the steering. This car is so quick to steer. It is amazing to me how quick it really feels and how quick it is. I do wonder a little bit about downforce with this car because it seems so slippery. There's no wing on the back, there's no inlets for like air to pass through, and yet it does 0 to 60 in 2.8 and it'll do like 190 miles an hour. So part of me wonders if you were really flying on the racetrack, you know, would you have some trouble kind of staying stable? And I do wonder about that, but I suspect most owners of this car probably won't really figure it out because not too many people are going to be driving this on the racetrack, although the owner of this one plans to. Now, the owner of this car said, take this thing out, do whatever, have some fun, go beat on it, whatever, but as you can understand, I'm a little apprehensive about doing that with it. I'm going to do a couple of quick... I mean, the car steers and handles and feels excellent. I mean, this is an 812. An 812 is one of the great sports cars that I've ever driven. It is an amazingly fun and thrilling car. This is that, just completely open. And I gotta say, this is an amazingly cool feeling. Like, it's so cool to be driving this and just totally open to the world. Like, this is so special. I am absolutely in love with this car. I know that this car is kind of opinion splitting. Some people don't like how it looks, which I think is insane because I find it absolutely beautiful. But other people say, oh, it's just a rebodied 812, whatever. I don't care. This is one of the coolest Ferraris I've driven. Maybe the coolest modern Ferrari I've driven in years and years. I think this is incredible. The SF90 is cool, but it looks like the other ones and it performs like the other ones. This gives you something special. The single-seater thing is so ridiculous, the ultra-limited production, and just this open-air feel. This is special, and it feels special, and not all modern Ferraris quite have that feel anymore, but this one truly does, and I love this car. I love this car. Let's do it!
And so that's the Ferrari Monza SP1, a truly amazing and incredible and exciting car. Ferrari really has become a volume brand these days. They're selling as many Portofinos and Romas as they can, but this is a reminder that they can truly make the good stuff when they want to. Anyway, now it's time to give the Monza SP1 a Doug score.
And the Doug score is here, 72 out of 100, which places the SP1 in amazing company among some of the world's best supercars. I find the SP1 to be fantastic. I know some say it's a cynical cash grab, just take the 812 and put a cooler body on it and charge millions, but I loved driving it. I love how it looks, and the rarity factor is also exciting. In a world where Ferraris have become pretty common, this car preserves the idea that there are still some elusive, magical ones you'll basically never see. Overall, I liked the SP1 a lot more than I expected to.
And then it spit out in this slot, is the term there I was looking for. Slot. Okay, let's try that again.